only gets to play 26 minutes. They're still trying to keep her on minutes restriction. They are pissed that she broke this record. They went and started all type of new racial conversations. Sandy Brondillo had to become a victim of a BS racist investigation, all because Caitlin Clark broke a record. And what happened in the game today? They kept her in punishment. They iced her out. Stephanie White iced Caitlin Clark out of this game, but the Indiana Fever still found a way.
There's a moment in every great athlete's career where they stop asking for permission, where the system that was built around them, the restrictions, the rotations, the carefully managed minutes, collides head-on with a will that simply refuses to be contained. For Caitlin Clark, that moment didn't happen in a playoff game. It didn't happen on a nationally televised finals stage. It happened at halftime, in a quiet corridor, when she walked up to her head coach and made one thing crystal clear. She wasn't coming out of this game. Not at 25 minutes, not at 30, not for any restriction on any jumbotron in any arena in this league. And what unfolded over the next 2 hours would remind every single person watching exactly why this particular player doesn't fit inside the box the WNBA keeps trying to build around her. The Indiana Fever were already handling business on the court. The New York Liberty, one of the most talented rosters in the entire league, were getting picked apart piece by piece. And right in the middle of all of it, a behind-the-scenes confrontation was quietly reshaping the entire dynamic between Clark and the organization that has been managing her return from injury with extreme caution. Tonight, that caution ran directly into a wall named Caitlin Clark, and the wall didn't move. Coming back from injury is never simple for any athlete, but when you're the most watched player in women's basketball history, every minute you're on the floor carries an entirely different kind of weight. The Indiana Fever's medical and coaching staff had put Clark on a 25-minute restriction as part of her managed return, a decision that on paper made complete sense. You protect your investment, you don't rush someone back, you monitor the load, track the physical responses, and gradually ramp up the workload over time. The problem is that Caitlin Clark at 80% is still better than most players in this league at 100, and everyone in that building knew it. For weeks, the minutes restriction had been a quiet tension running underneath the Fever season. Fans watching closely noticed the pattern. Clark would get going, find her rhythm, start cooking, and then suddenly she'd be on the bench while the momentum she built slowly leaked out of the building. The coaching staff defended every decision: load management, defensive adjustments, strategic rotations. The explanations were always clean, always professional, always perfectly constructed for the post-game press conference. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, Clark had already put the league on notice earlier in this stretch with a record-breaking assist performance that made WNBA history. She was locked in, her body felt right, her shot was falling, her reads were sharp, and when the halftime buzzer sounded and the Fever walked into that locker room, the last thing on Caitlin Clark's mind was sitting down for the fourth quarter. Here's what Clark actually said when asked about it afterward. She told Stephanie White at halftime that she felt really good and she did not want to lose this game, that she trusted all the work she'd put in on her body, that she'd spent a serious amount of time preparing for this moment. And then she delivered the line that said everything without leaving any room for negotiation. There was no way she was ever coming out of that game in the fourth quarter. She said she would have played on one leg. Let that sit for a second. This wasn't a player complaining about playing time in a post-game interview. This wasn't a passive-aggressive comment dropped into a press conference. This was a direct, face-to-face conversation at halftime where one of the most competitive players the sport has ever produced told her coaching staff exactly where she stood. No ambiguity, no diplomatic cushioning, just pure, unfiltered intent. And you have to understand what kind of statement that requires from an athlete. It requires absolute certainty in yourself. It believes a soul so deep in your own preparation and your own body that no external authority, no restriction, no rotation plan, no minutes chart on a clipboard can shake it. Clark didn't crash out emotionally, she didn't throw a tantrum, she stated her case clearly, grounded it in her own physical confidence, and let the results speak for the rest of the night. The Iowa competitor, that relentless, obsessive, will-not-lose version of Caitlin Clark that made the entire country fall in love with women's basketball. She showed up at halftime, and she did not leave.
Is the Clark show. I got to give the people what they want, and I'm not coming out of this game. Caitlin Clark finally stepping up and standing up for herself against this sabotage coaching staff, against this sabotage organization, and refused to come out in the fourth quarter when she surpassed her minutes restriction. We got to get into it, man. Welcome to Keep the Vision. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, share the channel, hit the bell notification, hype the video. That'd be greatly appreciated. Let's get right into things. So,
whatever conversation happened in that locker room, the second half told the whole story. Clark came out and was absolutely locked in. By the time the final buzzer sounded, she'd put up 41 points in a performance that had the entire arena buzzing. And it wasn't just the volume, it was the quality, the variety, the way she controlled the pace of the game and made every single decision look effortless, even when the Liberty's defense was throwing everything they had at her. Earlier in this recent stretch, Clark had already done something that had never been done in the history of the WNBA, a record-breaking assist performance that put her name in the league's history books in a way that went beyond just this season. She's not just scoring, she's not just shooting threes, she's directing an entire offense, seeing the floor at a level that most players in this league simply cannot match. The play that really encapsulated the night came late in the game with the score tied. The Liberty got a deflection and the ball skittered back toward half court. Most players would have let the possession die, regrouped, and waited for the next one. Clark chased it down, got to the ball, made a play that, by her own admission, she wasn't even sure was clean. She said she didn't know if she got the defender on the arm or not. But she made the play, came back down the floor, and did what elite players do in those moments. She created separation, attacked, and delivered. 41 points, and the feeling afterward that she could have played even better. That last part is the one that should genuinely frighten every other team in this league. She scored 41 and came out of the game thinking she left points on the table. That's not arrogance, that's the standard she holds herself to. And it's the standard that makes her nearly impossible to game plan against over the course of an entire season. Now here's where the tension between Clark and the coaching staff became visible to everyone in the arena. Despite the performance she was putting together, despite the fact that the Fever were clearly the better team on the floor, Stephanie White continued pulling Clark at the end of quarters, staying attached to the minute restriction framework even as the game situation made it look increasingly questionable. The crowd noticed, the broadcast noticed, and anyone who's been paying attention to this situation over the past few weeks had to acknowledge that the optics of benching your best player during a blowout repeatedly don't just look bad, they raise real questions about priorities. Because here's the thing about minutes restrictions. They exist to protect the player. They exist so that an athlete coming back from injury doesn't overextend themselves and end up back on the sideline for another extended stretch. That's a completely legitimate medical and organizational concern. Nobody disputes that. But there's a point where the restriction stops serving the player and starts serving something else. When the player herself is telling you she feels great, that she's done the work, that she trusts her body, and the restriction remains completely rigid, you have to ask whose interests are actually being protected. Clark's answer to that question was delivered not in words, but in performance. She put up 41 points. The Fever won by 20. The argument made itself. There's a separate thread running through this story that deserves its own attention, and it's one that could have serious consequences if it isn't handled carefully. Clark picked up her 6th technical foul of the season during this game. In the WNBA, the suspension threshold sits at 8, which means she is now 2 technical fouls away from being forced to miss games at a point in the season where the Fever need her on the floor every single night. And look, nobody's pretending that Clark is always perfectly composed out there. She's emotional, she's competitive to a degree that occasionally spills over. She's gone after referees in moments where the frustration built past the point she could contain it. That's documented, that's real. But it's also worth noting the context in which those technical fouls are accumulating.
This is a player who is competing at an elite level, coming back from injury, navigating a minutes restriction she clearly disagrees with, and doing it all under a microscope that no other player in this league faces on a nightly basis. The emotional investment isn't a character flaw. It's the same engine that produces 41-point performances and record-breaking assist nights.
The question isn't whether Clark needs to manage her emotions better on the floor. She does, and she'd probably be the first to say it. The question is whether the environment she's competing in is actively making that harder. When you're a player of her caliber being pulled at moments that don't align with game logic, when you're fighting for every minute while also trying to carry an entire franchise, the pressure that builds doesn't just disappear, it finds an outlet. Sometimes it's a great play in the fourth quarter. Sometimes it's a technical foul that puts your availability for future games at risk. 2 more and she misses games. That's not a storyline anyone in Indiana should be comfortable with right now. While all of this internal tension was playing out on the Indiana side, let's not lose sight of what actually happened to the New York Liberty in this game, because it was genuinely remarkable. The Liberty came into this matchup as one of the most talented teams in the league. On paper, this should have been a competitive game. On the floor, they were outclassed in a way that demands real analysis. Sabrina Ionescu, who carries enormous expectations every time she steps on that court, was effectively a non-factor after the first quarter. She finished with 12 points and 4 assists, numbers that look passable in isolation, but were almost entirely irrelevant to how the game played out. The Fever's defense in the second half made her invisible at the moments that mattered most, and she never found a way to force her way back into the game's rhythm. Marina Johannes had a decent first quarter and then disappeared entirely. Whatever she did in those opening minutes, the Fever made adjustments, and she never recovered. The Liberty's offense, which can be explosive and diverse when it's humming, became predictable and stagnant as Indiana's second-half defensive intensity ratcheted up. And here's the part that really tells the story of where this Fever team is right now. Their bench absolutely dominated New York's bench. This wasn't close. Sophie Cunningham came off the bench and was on fire from deep, going 3 for 4 from three-point range and finishing with 11 points and 4 rebounds. Ty Harris added 11 points of her own on efficient shooting with 4 assists. Michaela Timpson was solid, only 2 points but 5 rebounds and real defensive presence. Maisha Hines-Allen gave the team quality minutes. This was a bench performance that would be impressive for any team in the league. The Indiana Fever, without Clark being maxed out, still won this game by 20. That's the real headline that got buried under all the drama. This team right now is genuinely good, and with Clark fully unleashed, the ceiling is something that hasn't been fully explored yet this season. Indiana moved to 16-10 with this win. That record puts them in serious playoff positioning, and the trajectory of this team over the last stretch of games suggests they're hitting a level of consistency that should make every other contender in the league uncomfortable. Here's the honest conversation that needs to happen around this team. Stephanie White is not a bad coach. The minutes restriction existed for legitimate reasons. Load management is a real thing, and organizations have a responsibility to protect their players, especially ones coming back from injuries that cost them significant time. None of that is in dispute. But there is a real and growing tension between how this coaching staff wants to build their team and what Caitlin Clark actually is as a player. White has shown a clear preference for system-first basketball, a style built around structure, defined roles, and a balanced offensive approach that runs through multiple options rather than centering everything on one player. That's a philosophically valid way to run an offense. It works for a lot of teams. The problem is that Caitlin Clark is not a system player in the traditional sense. She's a system unto herself. When she has the ball and the freedom to operate, she doesn't just score, she elevates every player around her. She creates advantages that wouldn't exist without her presence. She forces defenses into impossible choices and then punishes them for whichever choice they make. Trying to run her through a rigid structural framework isn't just limiting her,
It's actively working against what makes her special. The conversation about Kelsey Mitchell's role is part of this same tension. Kelsey Mitchell is a legitimate offensive weapon, and nobody's questioning her ability. But there are moments in games where the ball needs to find Clark and it doesn't, and those are the moments where offensive possessions die quietly while the crowd watches in frustration. Clark, at her best, needs the ball in her hands, with the freedom to read and react. When that's happening, she produces historic performances. When it isn't, the Fever's offense loses something that no system can fully replace.
Tonight, Clark essentially forced the issue. She told the coaching staff at halftime exactly what she intended to do, then went out and validated every word of it. That's a conversation that's going to continue, and at some point, the organization is going to have to make a decision about which direction they want to go. This was a back-to-back situation for Clark, her first back-to-back in a couple of years, and she handled it by scoring 41 points and refusing to let her body or her minutes restriction become an excuse for anything less than her best. That level of physical and mental commitment in a compressed schedule is genuinely impressive and says something important about where she is in her recovery and preparation. At 16-10, the Fever are in a strong position. The season still has enough runway ahead that the decisions made right now about minutes, about roles, about how much freedom Clark gets to operate will have real consequences for how this team performs when the games matter most. Because here's the reality of playoff basketball. The structure loosens, the rotations get shorter, the margins shrink. And in those moments, you want your best player at full strength, with full confidence, with no residual frustration from weeks of feeling managed rather than empowered. You want her locked in, loose, and dangerous. You want the Iowa version, the killer, the one who chased down that deflection with the game tied and turned it into a winning play, because that's simply what she does. The minutes restriction may have made complete sense 3 weeks ago. Whether it still makes sense today, given what Clark is showing on the floor every single night, is a question the Fever's front office is going to have to answer. And based on the halftime conversation she had with Stephanie White, direct, confident, and completely without apology, Clark is already betting on herself, regardless of what that answer looks like. Step back from the game-specific details and the internal tension for a moment and look at what's actually happening here. Women's basketball has never had a moment quite like this one. The attention, the viewership, the cultural conversation, it's all operating at a level that the sport hasn't seen before. And at the center of all of it, every single night, is one player who generates more discussion, more debate, more genuine investment from casual fans than anyone the sport has produced in recent memory. That's not an accident. It's not marketing. It's not manufactured. It's what happens when a genuinely special talent competes with an intensity that makes every game feel like it matters. When Clark is on the floor, people watch. When she's on the bench, people want to know why. When she has a halftime confrontation with her coaching staff and then goes out and scores 41, people talk about it for days. The sport benefits from all of it. The wins, the drama, the debate, even the tension between player and organization. But the sport benefits most when that player is fully unleashed, when the restrictions are lifted, the rotations make sense, and the most talented player on the floor is given the freedom to compete at the level she's proven she can reach. Tonight was a reminder of what that looks like. 41 points, a refusal to leave the floor, a back-to-back handled with the kind of toughness that doesn't come from a minutes chart, and a post-game comment that will hang in the air for a while. She said she still felt like she could have played better. The Indiana Fever are 16-10. The season is not over, and Caitlin Clark has made it very clear she isn't done pushing this team towards something bigger than what the current system imagined for it. Whether the system adjusts to meet her or whether this tension continues to build is the storyline that will define Indiana's second half of the season. One thing is settled, though. She was never coming out of that game. Not on one leg, not on two, not for any number on any scoreboard or any restriction on any clipboard. And honestly, watching what she produced in that fourth quarter, you'd have had to be out of your mind to want her to.